Hey friends, Tiffany Dawn here, and welcome back to our September Monday Devos series, which I'm loving. So we've already talked about the invitation God gave us to come and eat of the food that will truly satisfy our hearts. And then we talked about the wilderness last week and how we get to this place where it feels like our life is falling apart and we're like, God, where are you? What are you doing? And sometimes the fact that we're in that wilderness is simply Him romancing us, bringing us closer to Himself. And this week, we're gonna talk about the journey. So when you're journeying through that wilderness, what do? What is it like? What can we learn from the people of Israel in Exodus 16, which is where we are today, about the journey? And as always, I'll have 3 questions at the end of the video for you, and I would love to hear your thoughts on those. So Exodus 16, we'll start with verses 2 and 3. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, their leaders, in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, where they were slaves, when we sat by the pots of meat and we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill us with hunger." Very dramatic. I'm sure it felt very dramatic though, because they're like in the wilderness, like we talked about last week, where at first it feels like there's nothing there. It's this barren, desolate, dry land. But it's kind of funny because you're like, did you not just see what God just did for you? Like, He miraculously brought you out of the land of Egypt where you were slaves and set you free, and now you're like, I wish we could go back there and die there because now I'm starving and at least we had food to eat there. And I think sometimes that's how we are on our journeys too, because it's easy to get so used to what we're familiar with that even if it's a bad situation, or even if we were slaves to something there, we just want to go back to what we're familiar with. Like, the journey toward freedom is unknown and unpredictable and scary. And I've seen this happen in my own life in many different times and ways, but one that comes to mind is when I broke up with this guy. I kept feeling like God was putting in my heart, like, this is not it. Like, I'm not supposed to be with this person. And it was so hard for me to let go of that. And when I finally did let go of that relationship, I was like, am I ever gonna get married? Like, will I be single forever? Essentially, will I starve relationally for the rest of my life because I gave this up? And even though I knew that the relationship hadn't been quite right, and there were some things that would have been issues, and I knew that God had something else for me, I still was like, well, but God, can I just go back to what I had before? And I did this with the first boyfriend, the really bad boyfriend that I had too. When I broke up with him, I was like, but I kind of want to go back to him. Like, I don't want to be single. I want to be in a relationship. At least I was in a relationship then. Both times with both of these guys, I went back and got together with them again for a little while before I finally had the courage to be like, no, this is not what God has asked me to do. I am just being rude and playing with their heart. This is not what I meant to do, and I have to let go and move on. But it's so easy to get so used to our environment that even if it's not quite right, or even if it's really bad, it can be easy to want to go back to where we were just because we're used to it. So let's look at verses 11 through 15. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you will know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all over the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said, this is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. And in verse 31 it says, the house of Israel called it manna, which literally means what? Or what is it? And it was like white coriander seed, and the taste was like wafers made with honey. And God rained this bread down miraculously in the wilderness. So first, let's talk about the name of this manna. What is it? Because I think sometimes when God starts to provide for us in the wilderness, we don't always recognize it at first as Him providing. I know in my own life, some of God's greatest gifts to me have been when He said no to something I really wanted. Even in relationships, I remember different guys being like, God, look at him. He'd be perfect. He's like 6'3" tall and dark hair and handsome, and he wants to be a pastor. Like, he's the one. And over, I felt like God would say, no, nope, it's not him. And I'd be like, what's wrong with him? Like, why can't he be the yes? And looking back, I can see how those guys would have been such a bad fit for me as a person. Like, we wouldn't have worked well together. And so many times the greatest gift God gave me was saying no to something I wanted. And so sometimes when God starts to provide for us, we don't even realize it's His provision. And we're just like, what is this? this isn't what I thought it would look like, but we need to have our eyes open. I remember at one point in my life feeling like God put in my heart to expect the unexpected. Be prepared to be blown away with things you might not expect. The other thing about manna that's really cool is that the manna was only when they were in the wilderness. As soon as they got to the place that was the promised land, even though they hadn't like taken control of it yet, but once they got to the promised land, the manna ceased. Verse 35 says, the children of Israel ate manna 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And Joshua 5:12 echoes this, saying, then the manna ceased on the day after they'd eaten the produce of the land. And the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. I think that's so cool because it's like this special provision that was just when they were in the wilderness. Like how sweet and special to have something like that God provides. Like I know one of the things for me in certain wilderness seasons was I had this sense of God's closeness in a way that I didn't normally have in my life. Like it was just deeper and more personal, and it was like I was so aware of him next to me. And then when I came out on the other side of the wilderness, I still knew he was with me, but it was different. And I think that this special, unique sense of his presence I had was like a gift during that wilderness season to remind me like, hey, I'm with you. I'm walking right beside you. And that's not to say I haven't had a sense of God's presence in other times of life, because I certainly have, but I think in some seasons, he allows that sense to be more clear and easy to perceive. And I think that's such a gift. Another cool thing about manna is that if you look at John chapter 6, Jesus talks about how it was a foreshadowing or like an example of what Jesus is to us. Like God miraculously gave them bread from heaven in the wilderness, but Jesus is the truest bread from heaven. Kind of like we talked about in week 1, the invitation, how Jesus is the truest bread and water that can fill our hearts. Okay, so verses 16 through 20. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather the manna according to each one's need. 1 omer for each person according to the number of persons, so telling them how much to get. Then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. So when they'd measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had according to each one's need. And Moses said, let no one leave any of it until morning. Notwithstanding, they did not listen to Moses, and some of them left part of it until morning, and it was filled with worms and stank. There was no fear of there not being enough. Like God provided just enough for that day's need, and each day they had to go out and gather again. But I think of us as Christians, like when we're feeding on the bread from heaven, which is a relationship with Jesus, so many times we rely on Sunday's portion of gathering our bread on Sunday and hoping it will last for the whole week instead of going out and gathering each day. And it kind of reminds me of vitamin C, which your body can't produce and it can't store, so you have to actually eat vitamin C every single day. You need more daily, just like we need time with God, gathering the bread from his word, from time with him every day. It reminds me of this song I wrote when I was in high school, and the lyrics are a little bit like cheesy sounding, but I love the idea of it. And it says, let me not rely on yesterday's encounters or the love songs we sang yesteryear. Draw me away again today and let me pour out my love over you. And it's just saying to God, like, I want more of you every day. I want to be with you every day. So then verse 32, I love this. Then Moses said, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Fill an omer with the manna to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. So Moses said to Aaron, take a pot and put an omer of manna in it and lay it up before the Lord to be kept for your generations. And I love that idea of like commemorating God's provisions to us, like remembering them. For me, it's through journaling. I write them down, like ways that he's provided, things that he's done, the unexpected things he's done that have blown my mind. Because then I can look back on my journals and remember. And when I feel afraid or when I have doubts or when I feel like anxious or like, God, are you going to take care of me this time? I can look back and see his faithfulness through the years and just how he has provided time and again. And it helps me trust him more, and it also just stirs up worship in my heart, like this gratefulness for all the things that he's done. So I have 3 questions for you again today, and I would love to hear your answers to these so we can study along together down in the comments below. The first one is this. What is the manna that God is offering you today? What is some of that provision? And we know like Jesus is the ultimate manna, but like what are the little pieces of provision that you might not even recognize as God's provision at first that he's giving you today? Number 2, how can you go out and gather it? What is one practical thing you can do to go out and gather in that manna and feast on his provision? And lastly, number 3, how can you commemorate God's wilderness provision to remember it in the future? So I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on these questions. Thanks for being with me again, and we have one more week of this study. Next week, we're going to talk about the vineyards, which is basically when you reach that land of freedom and when God starts to give you those vineyards out of the wilderness. What does that look like? What do we do with that? We're going to talk about that next week. Love you girls. Bye.